Good morning, guys. Happy Friday. It's March 7th, 5:48 a.m. Central Time. We're late again today because we had graphics problems. I'm going to end up in the mental hospital before this. This drives me absolutely insane. If our graphics don't work this time around, then the video is just going to have no graphics. I don't know. Okay, we had tariff news to start off. Let's go.
President Trump will temporarily pause his newly imposed 25% tariff on Mexican imports covered under the USMCA trade agreement until April 2nd. Trump announced the decision on Thursday after speaking with Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, who informed him that fentanyl seizures at the border had declined by more than 41% from January to February. Later in the day, Trump extended the same exemption to Canadian imports under the trade deal. Trump's shifting stance on tariffs has rattled financial markets, weakened consumer confidence, and created uncertainty for businesses. The stock market faced sharp losses again on Thursday. The Dow Jones dropped 1%, the S&P 500 fell 1.8%, and the Nasdaq tumbled 2.6%.
All right, Matt, if you're a farmer, this is your livelihood now. The market just moves on headlines which change every hour or every 5 minutes. It's frustrating.
Yeah, it's super frustrating, and clearly, if you're a farmer, you're pretty aggravated about this. You look at the corn chart; we basically stepped off a ledge due to tariffs, and so it's not just the day to day; it's the overall trajectory of the market. And so, yeah, like I was telling you earlier, I guess using my other hat, if you will, the marketing side of things, I'm trying to look at this more as a big picture type thing. Hey, what's the long term situation here? Because I think as a grower, if you get caught up in, oh my gosh, it's gone down here, what if it goes even lower? I think making a sell uh, based upon fear right now is probably not advisable. I guess from my vantage point, I think that there's a lot of things we'll talk about later on, from a fundamental standpoint that might give you pause for hope, but it's super aggravating.
Yeah, fear and greed drive bad decisions. There was a lot of talk, still is, about Mexico and front loading the export program. But when you look at the pace of sales and what Mexico's bought and how they've bought it, it's very similar to what we saw last year. And that led me to this next chart. I was curious about Mexico's actual supply situation, and their corn situation domestically is tight. They've got a 9% stocks to use ratio being projected, which means that they're chewing through what we're selling them, which is, I think, a really good thing for the U.S. farmer. The idea that, yeah, we're selling corn to Mexico, they're our biggest customer, and by the way, they're using it. It's not like China where they're just building this obscene amount of stocks. Like they're using it and they're tight.
No, absolutely. A couple of things you said here. So, when you look at the pace, yeah, going into the election, a lot of people said, hey, they're front loading. They're not going to buy a lot of corn after the election. They're just trying to beat tariffs, but at the same time, when you look at your chart, it's very similar to a year ago. It's just improved from a year ago all the way through, and so they just keep buying corn. The other thing is that yes, their stocks are nothing to get excited about. As far they're not burdensome by any means. I mean, they're getting tighter, and it's similar to a lot of other folks in the world. I believe I brought this up with you the other day, but Brazil, Argentina, and Ukraine. I mean, those guys are down 400 million bushels on their ending stocks from where they were at a year ago. And voila, the U.S. has just been exporting the daylights out of corn. And that business has become the U.S.'s. So, from a world ending stock situation, that's kind of what gives me a little more hope here that, this market could get pretty exciting if you have some sort of inclement weather.
Oh yeah, if we run into any sort of crop scare during the U.S. growing season, it's going to be a big deal. I mean, we talk about Brazil and soybeans and how they're so big, but the U.S. is still the big blockbuster growing season for the world. We're still the biggest producer and by a wide margin, so it'll absolutely matter this summer. This next story is, I'll call it tariff adjacent.
The U.S. plans to impose docking fees on ships linked to Chinese built or Chinese flagged vessels. The U.S. is also pressuring its allies to adopt similar measures or face retaliation. The executive draft order is part of an effort to strengthen the domestic shipbuilding industry and reduce China's influence in global shipping. The order also includes tariffs on Chinese cargo handling equipment. Last month, after an investigation into China's control over global shipping, the U.S. Trade Representative's office proposed fees of up to $1.5 million on Chinese built vessels entering U.S. ports.
You can almost call this like another tariff on China, except the U.S. is imposing it rather than China imposing. I mean, it's an additional restriction on U.S. soybean shipments to China in some ways.
No, it's an aggravation too. I mean, There's no doubt that we're trying to, I guess, throw jabs. They're throwing jabs. A lot of this is posturing, in my opinion, trade posturing, and certainly the trade pays close attention to it. So, to me, we've looked at this over the last several months, over the last year. Last summer, you and I were talking about the fact China hadn't bought any soybeans, and all of a sudden they go ahead and step in and buy a lot of beans. But at this time of year, they don't buy very many beans. So,
Mhm.
I guess I'm not as concerned about it in the here and now. The thing is, if we're going to put restrictions in and make it harder on them, what's it going to look like 9 months from now? And so that's whenever it's really going to be important because we've already sold a ton of beans. I believe we've got unshipped maybe 50 some million bushels, but and whenever it gets right down to it, we've shipped a ton of beans to them already.
So is China going to cancel beans? Old
Yeah,
crop? Yeah, you
I
think
believe
so?
they will. I
Yeah.
think that they will. I think China knows what cancellations do to the markets. China still needs to buy a lot of soybeans. I'm not saying that they're doing it for price manipulation measures, but I wouldn't put anything past them. I mean, they're extremely astute marketers and they know how this works. And we've seen it happen over and over and over again in the past. And so I absolutely believe that they'll cancel some sales.
Let's talk about China and Brazil.
Brazil will likely capture a larger share of China's agricultural imports amid ongoing U.S. China trade tensions. Earlier this week, President Trump announced an additional 10% tariff on China, prompting China to retaliate with tariffs of up to 15% on $21 billion worth of U.S. agricultural products, including meat and soybeans. As a result, Chinese importers may shift away from U.S. exports and instead boost their purchases of tariff free grains and protein from Brazil. During Trump's first term, as we can all remember, the US China trade war led to a significant decline in US agricultural exports to China, particularly soybeans, a market share that was never fully regained. Although the tariffs in this current trade war are lower than those of the first, they will likely accelerate China's long term move away from US supplies.
This seems pretty obvious and kind of like a known factor already. Oh, Brazil's going to ship more to China. I pulled this chart this morning and I've shown you guys this before. The amount of soybeans that China imports is very close to the amount that Brazil exports. And granted, all Brazilian exports will not go to China. All of Chinese imports will not be from Brazil, but it's like a match made in heaven.
Absolutely. And clearly at times like we've seen recently, you've been able to go to Brazil and get them a heck of a lot cheaper than the US. I believe a couple weeks ago we were 40 bucks a ton higher than what Brazil
Mhm.
was. And so, with currencies and whatnot, there's no doubt that Brazil likes or China likes buying Brazilian soybeans. And, I've got to think that over the course of time, Brazil is going to continue to grow. I mean, it's like average 3% increase in planted acreage over the last 20 years on a yearly basis. I mean, that's not something that's going to stop right away. They still have more land they can bring into production. And so I think China's just going to continue to buy more and more of their beans there.
Yeah. Let's go to export sales.
U.S. corn export sales increased last week. Net corn sales were reported at 36 million bushels. The print was up 15% compared to the previous week, but down 32% from the prior 4 week average. Japan was the largest corn buyer for the week. Net soybean sales were reported at 13 million bushels. The print was down 14% from the previous week, but unchanged from the prior 4 week average. China was the largest buyer. Net wheat sales were reported at 12 million bushels. The print was up 26% from the previous week, but down 25% from the prior 4 week average. Mexico was the largest wheat buyer for the week.
All right. So China was the biggest bean buyer, but this was a week that ended before they announced tariffs. Matt, prediction time during the next 6 weeks, will we see a negative old crop soybean export number?
Yeah, I believe so. And I think a lot of it has to do with what I said earlier. I think China knows. I mean, they're not buying any beans off of us right now. They've bought a few, but overall, they know that if they slow or cancel, that it would be problematic for the soybean market. And so I think that you're going to see negative shipments. I think that you're going to, your or sales anyway. I think you'll see cancellations, and I think shipments will slow to a crawl. And so we'll just have to see how it plays out. But my answer for your questions, yes.
Yeah. All right. Let's go to the drop monitor.
The Corn Belt experienced mostly dry conditions last week, causing drought to expand in Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri. Below average seasonal snowfall across the region, particularly up in Minnesota, is raising concerns. About 43% of the region is currently experiencing some level of drought, up from 32% at the beginning of the year and 38% at this time last year. The High Plains experienced above normal temperatures and dry conditions last week. Drought conditions were mostly unchanged throughout the area, except for slight expansions in southern Kansas and southwest Oklahoma. When we look at the percentage of U.S. areas experiencing drought, corn country 60%, soybeans 50%, winter wheat 24%, spring wheat 39%, and cattle country 38%.
We had some rain over the last 7 days. Iowa caught a lot of rain or snow. I don't know what it was. Wisconsin, a little bit of Illinois. Looking at the forecast, not really much, just trace amounts across the Corn Belt. But then you get into this extended period beginning like Thursday, Friday next week, and maybe some relief for the Dakotas, for Wisconsin, a little bit of Nebraska, maybe some more for northern Iowa, Wisconsin. What are guys talking about with regard to the dry conditions out west, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much everywhere I've been, especially west, though, because that's your question. People have just said how dry they are and that they're concerned. That from a subsoil standpoint, they're just worried, especially with some of the forecasts that this summer, could stay on that dry bias. And so I would say there's heightened concern with most people that I talk to, a lot of folks that respond to like my newsletter, for instance, because I will ask, what shape you in? And people just say we're excessively dry. We don't recall too many years being this dry in the past going into the growing season. So certainly a spring rain can fix a lot of woes. But at the same time, from a subsoil standpoint, you're not going to fix everything with one rain event or two, but recharging the moisture, at least the topsoil, I think is something that would be music to most people's ears.
What did cattle prices do yesterday?
Cattle futures were lower. Live cattle were 7 cents to 62 cents lower. Feeders saw losses ranging from 52 cents to 207. Box beef was mostly unchanged. Choice was down 42 cents at 313.12, and select was up 98 cents at 303.51.
And given all the tariff news, cattle have acted okay, Matt.
Yeah, they've acted okay. I mean, I still think that you could see more big time selling at some point. I see, the funds being, getting bored in here at some point. This last cattle on feed really injected some life into the market, but we've kind of just hung out ever since. And so I still think a person needs to at least stay protected. Fundamentally, long term, it's a great story. It has been for a long time, though, and I think that at some point, the funds may say, "Hey, this can't get any more bullish." Kind of like last summer with corn, they said this can't get any more bearish, and that's the biggest reason why they started covering those shorts. I'm afraid maybe they'll do some profit taking, as we move through here. So I'd still stay very well protected.
Outside market's not overly exciting, guys. Again, I apologize for being late. We've got technical difficulties 2 days in a row. If we don't have graphics, we don't have graphics. We'll be back on Monday. Have a great weekend, everybody.